Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. Oh, the Thursday mornings. I can't wait to have another Monday lecture next week, because then at least we're all properly awake. Hi, welcome to lecture number 16 on comparative politics, where today we will be talking about another policy area, or an area of public policy. So on Monday, we already heard about one that is maybe slightly more obscure, and maybe one that you hadn't thought about all that much in terms of what are states doing here and what do they want to achieve when we heard about innovation policy. Today we're going to talk about a public policy that you have undoubtedly heard about, that you've probably already thought about, and you more than likely have already encountered in terms of maybe reaping some of its benefits, and that is welfare state policies and welfare regimes. So what we're going to be talking about today is we're going to be talking about the welfare state and where it comes from, so how did it develop. We're going to be thinking about a typology or categories of different welfare states, what they do differently, how can we distinguish them, and then we're going to be thinking, like we always try to do, maybe in terms of research design a little bit, and we're going to be thinking about how can we explain outcomes, what variables do we have to look towards. Now, welfare state policies or welfare policies don't seem maybe like a super exciting topic, but it is one, and we have to remember that, it is one where we not only maybe have one of the most direct views of what states can actually accomplish, like this is one of the most pure fields in which you see the direct effect of state policy on citizens. But it's also, of course, one that is hugely important for us, maybe even on a personal level. The difference between eating, not eating, being employed, unemployed, being provided for when you're disabled and not, is the welfare state. So this, of course, has huge ramifications. And lastly, we should care about this because this tends to be the thing that states spend the most money on. So yes, defense is important in some countries in the world, but almost all, at least Western democracies, tend to spend a majority of their budget on welfare state policies. So it pays off to understand where this comes from, how we can classify this, and how we can explain these different outcomes that we see. So we should very much care about this as citizens and as political scientists. So let's think first about how to conceptualize the welfare state. Like, what is the welfare state? What are we talking about when we use that particular term? And it is maybe one of the simplest definitions comes from Asa Briggs, who says that a state in which power is used to modify market forces. So the state's power is employed in the service of maybe protecting or shielding people from the pure market, however that could look like. Whenever you try to do that, whenever you try to take the market a little bit out of people's lives and cushion them against what a free, unregulated market would do to them, then you are talking about welfare state policies. And of course, we use both sort of pure policies and the administration of a state to provide these kind of counterbalance to market forces. So this can include guaranteeing citizens a certain basic income, like there is a floor under which you cannot fall, there's a safety net for you, even if you can't work, even if you're old, even if you're sick, the state will provide some sort of basic income for you, and you don't have to worry that if your own money runs out, you are on the street. It could include policies that are designed to minimize insecurity. So it could provide you with value, it could provide you with resources, despite you not being able to partake fully in the workforce. And it can also entail providing a certain range of services, like not just providing you maybe with some money in your bank account, but with actual services that provide for you, even if maybe otherwise you couldn't pay for them, which of course is what a national health system is all about. If you had to pay out of pocket for all of these things that you need if you're very sick, just look at the US, what the outcome of those types of policies is. where having a desperate illness without savings can literally make you homeless. So all these different policies are all attempts to shield individuals from what would happen if they were only exposed to market forces. So, and a state that does these types of things, that provides for its citizens in this way, is what we normally call a welfare state. But of course, there are states that not only do this to varying degrees, they might also very well be states that don't do this at all. And while it might be maybe not that easy to find examples today of states providing zero welfare for their citizens, although you could probably come up with a couple of examples if you look at some failed or fragile states. Say if you're reaching retirement age in, I don't know, Somalia or South Sudan, you probably don't want to rely too much on the government providing you with a nice income in your old age. But if we look back a little bit in history, we of course see that this was actually the predominant model. The state wasn't supposed to take care of you. You were supposed to contribute to the state, but not necessarily without expecting all that much in return, maybe besides defense. So the welfare state is a form of state, as we've seen different states develop over the years. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about in the next couple of slides. So the welfare state is sort of an advanced stage in how states developed. You know, of course, that states didn't enter the global stage fully formed. They were very much sort of institutional skeletons with a very minimal crew to steer the ship. Sometimes not, over a large part of history, states couldn't even rely on a particular regular income from their citizens, or collecting revenue was very difficult. But over the course of this historical development, we see the welfare state emerge as one of the newer models that allows states to take care of their citizens. And the ideology that's underneath all of this is, of course, one that is maybe, well, we can think of it as a little bit enlightened, like a state should do more for its citizens than just make sure that the next invading army can come in. But also the idea that a state is not just kind of this political construct, but a state is a community. A state is, and of course that's what the modern nation state exactly is. It's a territory and its people. And the idea that these people need to be taken care of and provided for, that's really the underpinning for the welfare state as an idea. So there's a national community and we need to take care of it. It's not just, we don't happen to just rule over a particular set of land or forests or whatever. There is a people that that the state has a responsibility towards, of course, and the other way around, people also have responsibilities towards the state, but it's not a one-way street anymore. And of course, the assumption that's behind that is you can only think about developing a welfare state if you are happy with having a fairly strong, fairly well-organized, fairly centralized state on top. There's no way for you to provide lots of welfare if you can't collect your taxes, or you can't hire enough people to implement welfare systems, you can't provide for your people's health care. So you need a fairly strong state to even attempt to do this. You can't have a fragile state that provides lots of welfare to people because A, it's not going to have the necessary resources, and B, it's not going to have the infrastructure in place to provide this. So let's think about a couple of different perspectives of why welfare states then came along. We know that they're not very, very old. They're essentially an invention of the 19th century, so that doesn't mean we have to go that far back. And we have a couple of different theoretical perspectives that deal with, well, how did they come about? What made them be adopted? So the first one that I want to be talking about is functionalist explanations. Now, a functionalist explanation in anything, by the way, and there's not just functionalist explanations for welfare states, of course, there's functionalist explanations for lots and lots of other things, all the way from politics all the way up to IR. For example, if you remember from last year's ICEB, you remember maybe that some of the perspectives on how the EU came about are functional. The EU came about because it served a certain need. And that's everything that functionalist explanations are about. Functionalism means, well, basically an idea's time has come. There is a certain need. That need needs to be fulfilled, and therefore we adopt a certain thing. So it's, in a sense, it's a bit of an abstract theory. It's kind of a reaction to maybe abstract surrounding forces that gets states to adopt certain policies. So when we look at these two graphs, we see fairly quickly what functionalists point to as an explanation of why welfare states came along. So we see on the left hand the relative per capita industrialization. I'm actually not entirely sure how this is measured. I think this is measured by sort of an index that shows how much of your country's GDP is generated from, well, industry rather than, say, agriculture, for example. And you see that these lines are almost flat until the beginning of the 19th century, when, of course, the Industrial Revolution kicked off in Britain. And you see, indeed, Britain is the green line at the top here. And you see that in the course of the latter half of the 19th century, you see this extremely rapid industrialization. So an entire reorganization of societies, where suddenly tons and tons, millions and millions of people were moving from one sector to the other, creating all kinds of new pressures for the state to deal with. And then on the right, you see a parallel development that, of course, people weren't working in industries and still staying on their little family farm, but they were moving to urban centers. So the two dual forces of industrialization and urbanization really, that's what functionalists say, created a new need to take care of all these people that work in factories, that are industrial workers, and that lived in cities. This was a thing that hadn't been there before. If you'd gone to England in, say, 1800, neither would you have seen particularly big cities, nor would you have seen lots and lots of people working in industries rather than in agriculture, which was the tradition. So these are two of the historical developments that functionalists point to. And what they say is, well, these industrialization and urbanization created lots and lots of pressures on the state to take care of these people, because it wasn't just possible anymore to let this system, let these people kind of fend for themselves. So you had, for example, the problem if you were a farmer and you got sick or injured, that was bad, but you still had a farm, for example. You still had some subsistence maybe to live off. You had a field that you could cultivate and so on. If you were a factory worker and the only thing that you more or less owned was your own workforce, you were the only source of revenue. If you got sick, you were shit out of luck. Like, there was nothing really that you could do. And the worst thing that could happen to you was that you had to go to the poorhouse eventually. So the difference was, of course, that you were in a city, you had no real assets besides your own work, and if you couldn't do that, that was it. So how did you take care of these people? Because obviously there wasn't just 5 people that had this problem. There was potentially hundreds of thousands or even millions of people that might have this problem. In the earlier days, maybe you could rely on families or churches or charity, the charity of the Lord of the Manor or something, to take care of these people, but there were far too many people. They were far too concentrated, and this both would have stretched the resources that come out of this kind of informal system to take care of people to the breaking point and beyond. So it was clear that something else some other actor had to step in. And of course, this urbanization, this move of people from the country into the cities, also weakened the very institutions that had taken care of people before. It was a difference, of course, whether you lived in your little parish with 20 houses and there's a church in the middle, and then it's pretty clear if something happens to you, maybe the community comes together. Once you live in sort of tenement buildings with 500 workers somewhere in London, and no one really knows you, then that community aspect of taking care of people, well, it gets very difficult, and you can't really rely on it anymore. So functionalists say it's very simple. States try to react to these needs of their citizens. There was problems within society created by sort of external forces, and that really forced the state's hand into adopting welfare state policy. What you see on the right here is, I think, an interesting graph that shows you 2 different axes. It shows you how economically developed were states when they adopted their first welfare program. So you see on the vertical axis, you see the year of adoption. So the further down you are, the earlier you adopted the policies. And you see on the horizontal axis how rich the state was before it adopted it. And you see that this is well, I mean, it doesn't quite work, but I mean, you can if you imagine a 45-degree diagonal line, most states in the system will lie on that line, which shows us that as you economically develop, the need to adopt certain welfare state policies also increases. Obviously, there's some countries that are bucking the trend here, like the US, for example, took a very long time to introduce the first welfare programs. And there's a cluster on the left-hand side of Portugal, Greece, and Japan, for example, that weren't prosperous at all when they adopted welfare state programs. So that explanation doesn't quite work in all circumstances. But that's the functionalist explanation. There's sort of abstract forces around us, historical forces that shape and reshape society, and states are reacting to that by adopting welfare state policies. And if we compare Germany and the UK, we can see these forces, say functionalists, we can see these forces at work pretty well. So Germany, of course, famously one of the first countries in the world to adopt any sort of welfare state policy, actually the very first one that adopted a proper welfare state policy that we still recognize today. So it was Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor himself, that passed social insurance legislation. And this was very much a reaction to kind of workers' movements within Germany. There was rumblings within Germany. Workers weren't being provided for. They were angry with the government. They weren't properly taken care of. They didn't feel represented. No one was doing anything about it. And the easiest thing that Bismarck could think of was, well, let's just buy them off. So let's provide them with some welfare. Let's make sure that they don't fall underneath a certain level of subsistence. And maybe that will quell the discontent that is happening in the country at the moment. And this kind of insurance system that was set up in Germany all the way back in the 1880s is, obviously with adaptations, but is still in force today. On the other hand, we see the UK, which took a slightly different trajectory. So we see a much, not much, but we see some decades pass between Germany adopting these types of policies and the UK thinking about adopting these certain policies. Mostly because the UK was still, Great Britain was still sort of locked in this kind of Victorian liberalism idea of, well, we as a liberal community, we are enlightened enough to take care of our weakest members of society. But the idea was still very much that this wasn't something that the state was supposed to do, but this is something that sort of society had to take care of itself. Think about it as like a charitable initiative. We do this out of the goodness of our hearts, not because, for example, these poor people have rights or the state has responsibilities towards those people. And you see it takes almost 30 years after Germany has adopted these policies until the UK finally comes around to adopting its first National Insurance Act, its first insurance policy. And it takes until after the Second World War to then build out that system further. So there's a lovely quote by a historian that says that the welfare state in the UK germinated in the social thought of late Victorian liberalism. It reached its infancy in the collectivism of the pre- and post-Great War statism. So kind of the Great War bringing everyone together, but also showing everyone how important the state is. Matured in the universalism of the 1940s, everyone against the common enemy, and flowered in full bloom in the consensus and affluence of the 1950s and 60s. So obviously the UK was doing quite well after the Second World War, coming out as a victor. But it took a longer time, and functionalists would argue it might have taken a longer time because there wasn't some of the forces inside of Britain that Bismarck was reacting to. There wasn't a wide-scale sort of workers' movement that was demanding these types of things. And so therefore they took longer. The pressures weren't there, so they took their time. Now, linked to these types of explanations, functionalist explanations, and I've already hinted at that in my last couple of sentences, there's explanations that look at interests, mostly of subnational societal groups, and conflict between them. And they point to the fact that different states have taken different trajectories towards the welfare state because they had different types of pressure groups inside of them with different amounts of influence. So you have countries in which you see the welfare state being a bottom-up project, coming from within society, the state being forced by social democratic movements or labor movements to adopt certain policies that would serve the clientele of social democratic or labor movements. But this type of explanation doesn't really work all that well in countries other than, say, Germany, or the most famous case is Sweden, which is why this is sometimes called a Swedocentric explanation. And this kind of bottom-up drive to adopt welfare state policies that didn't really happen in many other countries that way. There could also be explanations built on societal interests that are thinking about this in a top-down way. So could this be, just like in Germany, could this be an attempt by the elite to quell discontent about the living conditions of the people? So not really something, so that's not a reaction to, say, workers' movements demanding we want a welfare state, but it is an elite project that says, well, the workers want something, they're not doing well, so what we're going to give them is a welfare state. Parentheses, whether or not they wanted that. So that's the two different approaches, right? The one approach where labor movements actually call for this adoption, and the other thing where elites just choose this as one of the projects to appease workers and laborers in popular movements in their own state. But I mean, obviously, the problem with these explanations is that they never quite fall very well in one of the two sides. Like, it's hard to find a country where this is a purely top-down project, for example. I mean, you could argue that in Germany, even if it's listed as an example here, there was plenty of people within the workers' movements that had called for welfare states, rather than leaving this to be entirely an elite project. You see, by the way, on the right, a lovely caricature of Bismarck, of course, that is trying to adopt welfare state policies to put the socialist Jack back in the box at the time. And then you could have explanations for welfare state policies that point towards the concept of social citizenship. And if you've paid very close attention last year in ICEB when I talked about human rights in the context of the UN, you might recognize some of these concepts. If you remember from that lecture, probably you won't, but if you remember from the lecture, there's a few different strands of rights that were being introduced by states, but they didn't all come into being at the same time. They were sort of built on top of each other. We had sort of an early move, kind of an 18th century move, to have the state assign civil rights to people, so liberty, freedom, all those kinds of things that kind of safeguard your very person, which then became a precondition or a prerequisite for the democratic rights that the 19th century expanded greatly. So universal suffrage, the franchise for everyone, people running for elections, people being able to participate in their democratic states, which then became the precondition or the prerequisite for the types of social rights of citizenship that go beyond just sort of being safeguarded and that cover things where the state provides for you. So not just things that protect you from the state, but social rights of citizenship. Social citizenship means that the state provides you with the means to fully partake in society. It's not sort of passive, like, yeah, we'll leave you alone. It's a lot more active, the idea of social citizenship. We should enable all our citizens to fully take part in the economy, in social life, in cultural life, in political life, and so on. And this is, of course, a much more far-reaching concept of the rights that you should gain compared to just civil or democratic rights. So the idea of social citizenship is more than just equality of status. It is sort of both the equitable right to, well, all the services that a state can provide, but it's also kind of the basis of solidarity among citizens. So it's built on the idea that we shouldn't just all be our little atoms kind of in the state doing our own thing, but that there is a certain sense of solidarity and that certain risks should be shared by all, and that all those that are part of this national community should be taken care of or should be able to rely on some level of security or safety. And then we can have institutionalist explanations of why welfare state policies came along. You can point to an institutionalist explanation whenever authors point out that there are certain sort of state infrastructure factors that were at play when adopting welfare state policies. So this could be either sort of the role of elites, this could be sort of conflict imperatives like we already talked about a couple of slides ago. This could be sort of exogenous factors. Maybe states are competing with each other. Maybe states are competing each other in terms of how well they can provide for their citizens. Maybe you want to attract people. If you think of a country that wants to attract lots of bright immigrants, maybe one of the ways to do that could be that you adopt progressive welfare state policies, that you don't have to be afraid when you move there. So there are explanations that point to sort of what shape is the state, and what follows out of the shape of the state, and why are welfare state policies the thing that a state of that particular status and structure should adopt. So there's a lot of different explanations, and I don't want to bore you too much with all these different kind of theoretical explanations of why the welfare state came about, and you can think yourself about what you think is most convincing. Is this mostly sort of a historical trajectory, or is this mostly based on interest groups within the state, and which can happen, of course, in any kind of part of history? So let's move on to some different welfare state regimes and how welfare states can be typologized and categorized across the globe, because obviously this is comparative politics, so we want to know how to compare things properly. So we see on the left a map that is partially built on the system by ESPA Kenderson, which you've undoubtedly heard at this point, and maybe even have read. And you see that in Europe alone, there's a good bit of variation in terms of how welfare states are organized, and we're going to talk about what these welfare regimes are in a second. But you see that there are a couple of different models across Europe, how to organize a welfare state, how much to provide for your citizens. But you also see that this is not just some kind of weird quilt where countries more or less are grouped together in random. There's clearly something going on here in that you have, for example, Nordic countries that all seem to have adopted similar welfare state structures and policies. You have sort of a continental bloc. You have something that we call the liberal model. We have to call it a liberal model. We can't call it the Anglo-Saxon model because Switzerland snuck its way into that particular category. And you have other things going on in Eastern Europe that don't seem to fit the mold of what's going on in the rest of Europe. So there's variation there, of course. There's different ways to organize welfare states. And we can also see that states spend very different amounts of money on their welfare state. So not just in terms of how is it organized, but also how elaborate is it? How much redistribution does it have? How much money does it play with? And you see, for example, that France is the current world record holder in terms of how much of what percentage of its GDP goes towards public social spending at over 30%, at least that's 2016 values. And you already see that there's also a bit of a stratification there. There's clearly a difference between states at the top end, such as France and Italy, which hover around 30% of GDP, which is a huge amount of money, of course. But then you have states at the other side that are almost down there at like sort of 15, 16, 18%, US, Australia, and Canada, which also, of course, might have something in common. So there's something going on here. There's a stratification here. There seem to be different models at work in terms of how a welfare state can be organized. And the seminal work here, of course, that thought about, well, maybe not every welfare state is unique. Maybe welfare states can be categorized, was ESPA Kenderson. I never know if his first name is Gosta or Gusta, or however you pronounce it. So ESPA Kenderson wrote a book called The Three Worlds of Welfare Capitalism, which you've already probably encountered in some way before in your political science studies. If not, then this is a seminal work that you need to be aware of. And what he does in this book is he basically makes exactly that argument. Welfare states aren't random. Welfare states cluster together in groups, and they can be grouped into particular models. And he makes these models by pointing out that there is a couple of key dimensions on how welfare states can be classified. There is one, how the welfare state's approach is, how that particular model's approach is to what's called rights and decommodification. And what decommodification means, and this is a key concept in welfare state policy, means that I'm going to put this as simply as possible, Decommodification means how well are you if you're not able to participate in the market, or if you don't want to participate in the market. If you want to take yourself out of the market, how bad a decision is that for you? That's the simple way of putting this. States that are highly decommodified, or welfare states that are highly decommodified, that means that in that particular state, it's not all that much of a risk taking yourself out of the workforce. Yes, of course, it's not going to be as good as working, but you don't have to worry and chew your nails down if you fall out of the workforce for a little while. Countries that don't do this, countries that have a low level of decommodification, or welfare states that have a low level of decommodification, it's not really designed to provide you all that much of a safety net. You might be okay for a very short term, but certainly not long term, and the level of benefits that you receive is probably also going to be pretty low. So, to what degree can you take yourself out of the market, and are you going to still be okay? That's what decommodification means. The welfare states are different in terms of the social stratification that they work on, and they are different in terms of how they conceive the relationship between what the state is supposed to provide, what the market is supposed to provide, and what families, and maybe you can say family, you can also say something like your social environment is supposed to provide. So there's a couple of key dimensions on which welfare states seem to differ. So let's look at which different models then ESPA Kenderson identified all across Europe. So this was sort of Europe and the Western world. He didn't really look at places like Asia and Latin America and all that, presumably maybe because he didn't know them all that well. But the argument, of course, would be that other states can also be classified in these typologies. So we have on the left-hand side the sort of liberal model. The liberal model is built on the idea that benefits should be very modest. You should get a little pocket money, but it certainly shouldn't be, the state shouldn't provide you with enough welfare to live well. And whenever you see, I don't know, newspaper stories like immigrants were immediately given great smartphones and blah, like that is all built on this idea that, well, clearly the welfare system should provide you with a minimum amount of resources, not with great resources for you to live off. The entitlements that you get will be fairly strictly administered. So it will be difficult for you to get these entitlements. It's not going to be automatic. Your means will probably be tested. Do you really not have any money? Do you really not have any wealth? Do you really not have any family that are able to take care of you? Which is a process, of course, that aims to minimize the amount of people that have to be given benefits. Can also be, of course, a pretty humiliating process. If you have to go to a city office and you have to show that you are really, really, really broke and no one wants to help you. You have a low level of decommodification. I already talked about that, what that means. It means that these states make it fairly costly for you to take yourself out of the labor force. Your main drive should always be to stay, remain, and get into the labor force. They have normally a high level of private welfare, if you can call it that. So the system relies on sort of private enterprises, charities, churches, and so on to take care of vulnerable members of society. And whatever social stratification you have, however kind of society divides itself, is more or less considered to be the result of the market. So if you have very rich, very poor people, not much in the middle, I guess that's just what the market provides us with, and there's really no reason for the state to intervene there. And this, of course, is the Anglo-Saxon model that you see in some of the Anglo-Saxon countries, such as Ireland, New Zealand, the UK, and the US. And if you want like a short little mnemonic device, how can you remember what that liberal model is all about? It's a model of this should be a last resort. So welfare state policies are a last resort. That's the very last thing you ever want to access or have to go through. And it's the very last thing that the state should provide, behind providing many other things. Then you have the conservative or continental model in the middle, which is a little bit different, but it's a difference in degrees. It pays off a medium amount of benefits. It's mostly a system that works on you paying into a certain social security system, and you get maybe in relation to how much you paid into it, you get relatively much out of it. The state really only interferes when sort of private ways to take care of you are exhausted. And whatever social stratification you have, well, they're going to be replicated. They're not going to be replicated maybe one-to-one because you have a certain level of benefits, so you should probably not have as many people, for example, at the bottom end of the spectrum as in a liberal system. But a conservative sort of continental system is okay with market forces sort of more or less determining how society divides itself up. And this is the model that you see in Germany and some of the German-speaking countries, and you also see this in France, for example. And the overarching theme of the continental model is that it should provide security for its people. So maybe a model that thinks more from the perspective of the citizen rather than from the perspective of the state, as in the liberal model, where things should be a last resort. And then lastly, you have the what's also been called the Nordic model, or the social democratic model, where you get a high level of benefits that are not very hard to access. The public side of providing these benefits is very high, and the system doesn't really rely on private welfare provision all that much. Either the goal or the starting point is a society that has a low level of societal stratification, so you want a fairly equal society rather than an unequal society. And this is the model that you see, for example, in the Nordic countries, as you saw on our previous map, that all seem to have adopted a similar type of welfare state, that is where welfare is all about this idea of citizenship, or social citizenship. So you see these different themes are, of course, very distinct. And ESPA Kenderson says, well, this is really what we're going for. These are the main types that I can identify, and almost all countries who fall into one of these categories at any point of their welfare state development. Now, you could, of course, ask, well, is that really true? Can we not think of maybe other ways to organize welfare states? And most of the reaction to ESPA Kenderson afterwards has been to say, well, look, dude, you didn't really do a good job of getting us the whole variation of how welfare states can be organized. People have pointed out, for example, that there is a Mediterranean model that is different from the continental model, and that we see in states like Greece, Italy, Spain, and Portugal, where you have sort of low social expenditure. They don't spend a ton of money on their citizens, but they have very strong employment regulation. For example, they have very strong rules in place how workplaces are regulated. They have strong rules in terms of how pensions are given out and who can access those pensions. And you see, by the way, in the graph in the middle that the Mediterranean system on the right pays the largest amount of its welfare in the form of pensions compared to the other system. And so the Mediterranean model is all about sort of employment protection. It really tries hard to keep you in employment or to catch you when you fall out of employment. But it's not really designed to provide like a huge amount of other benefits necessarily to you. And then, yet other researchers again have identified what they call a radical model, and they say, well, look, the liberal model isn't actually the liberal model. It's actually two models in disguise. There is a liberal model, yes, and it is the one that we see in the US, for example, but there's also what they call a radical model that is different from that. And it's different because what it's trying to do is it's trying to strongly regulate work conditions and wages, which is something that, of course, famously the US doesn't do. You can find a job in some US states, you can still find a job as a waiter that pays you $2 an hour, and you're relying on tips to make your living. That, of course, that wouldn't be legal in a system that has this radical model because it's trying to strongly regulate how labor relations and laws work and how they work for the individual. And we see this, for example, in Australia and New Zealand. So there's a bit of a discussion. Everyone sort of agrees that, yes, there might be these three models, and then there's much disagreement in terms of aren't there more models in this regard. And I mean, as a little bit of a test for yourself maybe, you can think about, well, which type of welfare state would you want to live in? Or which type of welfare state do you think is an appropriate way to organize public welfare? Do you agree, for example, with the statement that it's the responsibility of the government to reduce differences between people with high incomes and low incomes? Do you think it's government responsibility to make a more equal society? If you agree with that, you would probably want to move to a country like Austria or Germany, where that is part of what the system is designed to do. If you don't like that and you're fine with people being very rich and very poor because maybe you think that you're going to be rich one day, then you should move to a country like the US. if you have a statement that talks about whether the government should provide a job for anyone who wants one. So is it the government's job to give you a job? If you think that is true, yes, everyone that's willing to work should be provided with an opportunity to work and make their own living. Then you probably want to be in a country like Norway or Sweden, where again, that is part of what the welfare state is built on. If you don't think that's the case and that you don't think that's the state's responsibility to just, I don't know, have people build random bridges in national parks, then you probably want to be in Australia or Canada. And then lastly, if, of course, that's very much a discussion of our time, if you think that the government should provide some sort of level of basic income, whether that is actually a universal basic income or just sort of a level that allows you to subsist, if you agree with that statement, then you probably want to be, again, in Norway or maybe also New Zealand. If you think that, no, absolutely, that is not the government's job and the government should get off our backs and maybe have taxes that are as low as possible, then you definitely want to be in the US. So you see, like, every welfare system is sort of built on a series of choices to some key questions about how much the state is supposed to provide for its citizens. Now, and I've already talked about this, and I'm only going to go over this really briefly. There's, of course, been some criticism of ESPA Kenderson for a variety of reasons. Maybe the most easy one is, hey, you put a state into a category where it doesn't belong because there's other things going on. But, of course, the idea behind his model was that these are ideal types. They're not necessarily meant to be like the liberal model is equivalent to one specific country that adopts this, because every country is sort of on a spectrum on each of these scales. And there's a couple of other criticisms that have come out. So whenever you read ESPA Kenderson, remember that the book is already almost 40 years old and that there's been a lot of criticism, a lot of reaction to the categories that he noted. But most comparative scholars still think that's a useful tool to understand how welfare systems divide themselves up. Now, we could be thinking about, well, do welfare systems converge? And of course, this is one of the questions that you can choose, I think, as for your essay. So again, this is only going to be briefly covered because I don't want to do your work for you, or I don't want to take all the interesting work away from you. One of the main questions that have been asked over time is, of course, will these different types of systems, will these different models be just here in perpetuity? Or is there a degree of movement from states? Do states sort of gradually maybe move more towards the Nordic model as their citizens demand more benefits? Or is the whole system sort of due to, I don't know, the pressures of globalization or something? The system is ever more competitive. Are states sort of gradually coming away from providing all that much for their citizens and reducing their services down to a more basic level? So that's the idea behind convergence. And you could find arguments for both sides of the argument, pro-convergence or against convergence. But like, whenever you think about whether or not convergence happens, one of the main things that you must do is you must choose your variables carefully that you look at. Because obviously we need to measure convergence in some way. You need to be able to measure or say why or how states have become more or less similar over time. So you might want to think about what types of benefits are they giving out, what types of entitlements, how highly decommodified is the system, and other things. And you can, of course, do this in a quantitative way. There's really good data on many welfare state policies. You can do this at a large N scale. Or you can do this qualitatively. You can pick two countries, for example, that used to be very far apart, and you can see have they become closer to each other, and if so, which of them have moved, or have both of them moved. So there's lots of different ways to investigate this type of question, but the main thing is that you make really clear what you understand by convergence and what is supposed to converge here in this particular case. Many previous studies of convergence are looking at sort of aggregate spending, and they are looking at, well, are states sort of all spending more or less the same? So, of course, you would think, like we saw in an earlier graph, that some countries seem to spend only like 15% of their GDP on public social spending, while other states seem to spend over 30%. Is this getting more equal over time? Do states sort of find a stable equilibrium at, I don't know, 22% of how much they spend? And what you see is, well, there is certainly movement. And how you read this graph is the black bar that's inside of one of the vertical bars is the level of spending in 1960. the little square is the level of spending in 1990, and the blue bar itself is the level in 2016. And you can see that most countries have seen a rise, sometimes dramatic rise, in how much they spend on their welfare systems. So all the countries that have the black bar underneath the gray square and that one's underneath the top of the bar, those are the ones that are spending more. But this is not a uniform movement. There is some states that have actually reduced their welfare state spending. So the Netherlands, for example, and New Zealand, and to a degree also Sweden, have actually reduced the expenditure on their welfare states. And the other thing that we see, of course, is that not all states have increased their spending equally, and certainly not from similar levels. So just from looking at sort of aggregate spending, it's hard to tell a story of convergence alone. So what do we do when we don't just want to rely on aggregate spending to investigate whether or not there is a certain convergence in welfare state policies? Well, we could take a rights-based approach, and we could look at how many states have extended particular rights, social citizenship rights to their citizens, and to what degree have they extended them. Or we could take an outcome-focused approach where we look at, for example, have the different welfare states been successful in reducing inequality in their states? And has this become more of a benchmark that we can apply to different states over time? Or we can look at levels of poverty, we can look at sort of levels of happiness and well-being and similar things. So again, any of these ways is feasible, but you should be clear about what you choose here and what you choose as the outcome that you're looking at. So another thing we need to keep in mind is always read your graphs and your tables really carefully, because there is, for example, a major difference if you look at income inequality, which is a graph on the left, or you look at wealth inequality, which of course is a very different thing. You can have countries, for example, that have had changes over, especially recent changes, that have reduced income inequality, but if you don't give this a while to play itself out, differences in income inequality are unlikely to greatly reduce differences in wealth inequality, because it takes a while for the very poor to get richer and for the rich to get poorer. So again, look very closely at what exactly is being measured and what you can draw from it. And you see, for example, that the ranking can be very different if you look at income inequality compared to wealth inequality. Let's just pick one out here. So we have, for example, Denmark, which on income inequality is actually doing very well. Like lower values mean there's less income inequality, so the country as a whole is more equal. And Denmark, you see, is the second lowest country in the entire data set on the left here. But if you look at wealth inequality, Denmark is the top 3 in terms of wealth inequality. So clearly, depending on what you choose to look at, you will get very different results in terms of has Denmark been successful at reducing inequality. And that then will also determine how you compare these things across cases and how you judge whether or not two countries have become closer in how they reduce inequality or not. There's lots and lots of quantitative data that you can use to investigate these types of questions. The OECD has very good data, but remember, the OECD only collects data for OECD states. So if you also wanted to look, and I think that would make a really interesting essay, if you wanted to look at welfare state convergence elsewhere, or, for example, do states in other world regions become more similar to European welfare state systems, then maybe you want to go with something like the World Bank data, because they, of course, have global data, and not just data for the 36 odd OECD countries. And, of course, there's a wealth of qualitative data that looks at, for example, specific states and how to organize their welfare state policies. And of course, there's already out there plenty of comparative studies that look at a couple of states together. Again, remember that case selection is really important here, and you will get really different results, of course, depending on which countries you compare. So we have, of course, a number of different variables that could all affect welfare states. So remember, the welfare state could be in the middle of your equation. You could be explaining how did the welfare state come about, so the welfare state as an outcome, or you could be looking at what effects does the welfare state have, so the welfare state as an independent variable. And if you, whether or not you look at one of these two sides, so you can, for example, on the one side, if you look at how did welfare states come about, you could look at things that I've already mentioned. You could look at how did the party system develop, how did the relations between labor and employers or labor and the state develop, how quickly were certain values that encapsulate why welfare states are important, how quickly did they spread, and you could look at a couple of other factors that also explain why particular welfare state systems come about that are more universal and that look less inside the state and more at sort of general zeitgeist type historical developments that might have pushed states towards adopting welfare policies compared to other periods in time. So regardless of what approach you take, be really clear about what your variables are, what the equation is that you're looking at, and how you're measuring certain things. Otherwise, you're going to end up with an essay where you could have written like 40,000 words, but you really only have a handful. So be crystal clear at the very beginning how you approach that particular question. So as a little summary for today, we've seen that welfare states, there's been different explanations in terms of why welfare states have come about. But no one explanation by itself really presents us with sort of a picture that encapsulates every single state that has adopted these policies. But we can do comparative research that maybe gets us closer to identifying these different historical pathways that welfare state development has taken, whether those are large N or small N studies. But there's lots and lots of variation in terms of how states organize this. There is certainly not one model of this is how you do the welfare state, this is what you have to provide for your citizens. We already see great variation within Europe, and we would probably see an even greater variation if we expanded our focus a little bit and looked outside of Europe too. So there's lots and lots of variation that needs to be explained, and in some cases is still left to be explained because we haven't gotten really good answers. But almost all welfare states nowadays face similar problems. So they are trying to address similar challenges created by globalization, by democracy, by demography, by socio-political problems, by environmental problems, as we're going to see in one of the coming lectures. But the question is not so much, are they facing different challenges? The question is, how are they answering these challenges? And how does the society answer these key questions about the role, the relationship between the state and its citizens? Is the state supposed to provide you with a job? Is it supposed to provide you with an income or not? And depending on how we answer that, will we make our welfare state? Okay, thanks very much, guys. I'll see you next week.